Okay, brilliant. I think we are now live, fingers crossed. Hopefully, some people will be able to kind of jump in soon and comment and let us know that it's broadcasting somewhere. Yes, brilliant. We've got a couple of viewers as well now already, so that's a good sign. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming along to this live video. Today I'm joined by Dr. Elsa Verbeek. She's a researcher and animal behaviourist based in, where are you based at the moment? Remind me.
In Uppsala in Sweden.
In Sweden. I was thinking I'm not going to be able to say that in one go without practice. So thank you for jumping in there. So I'm really, really excited to have you with us. I've seen quite a lot of the research you've done and some of the courses that you're offering now. And I know you were just telling me before we started this, you're offering something brilliant in noise phobia in dogs, which is such a massive problem that so many dogs face. So I think to start off with, for those that don't know you, perhaps you could just tell everyone a little bit about your background and how you got into working with dogs.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So nice to be here. So my name is Elsa, and how did I get into working with dogs? That's a good question. It actually started quite a long. How far back do you want me to go?
You can go as far back as you like, yeah.
As far back as I like, yeah. No, I've always been interested in animals, of course, and actually my very first dog was when I was 12. So this is a long time ago, so I won't go into the details, but this was in the 90s. So you might be familiar with the training techniques that were used in the 90s. So it was all dominance theory and being the boss. And if your dog didn't listen, you had to pull at the lead. And so we had this lovely dog. He was really, really nice, but he wasn't very obedient. So we went to these dog training classes and got taught to pull at the lead when he didn't listen. But, you know, it didn't help anything. And then at some point, I just started wondering, well, what's going on here? And I got really interested in animal behavior, like learning, why is this dog actually not listening? What is going wrong with this communication between us and the dog? And then when I finished high school, I decided to go and study animal science in the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands. I'm originally from the Netherlands. So, and then I was really interested in ethology, so the study of animal behavior. And not just dogs, I have to say, it was much more broad, with lots of different animal species. And I kind of went off a bit with farm animals because that was the focus at the time, because I was going to solve all the problems in the world that we had with farm animals. So I focused on that. I went on to do a PhD in New Zealand and then a postdoc in Australia. And here I got really interested in like the emotional state of animals. And this was sheep, all sheep. And then in 2014, I really missed Europe. So we started, we came back to Europe, to Sweden, not to the Netherlands, but to Sweden. And then quite soon after, I was a bit fed up with farm animals. And I thought, why not do something in dogs again? So I went all the way back to what got me started to begin with. And so I submitted a grant to look at separation anxiety in dogs, and at the same time to develop some new tests about how can I actually measure emotions, because I'd started on that as a postdoc. And then I was interested, well, how does it work in other species? What about dogs? Because they are so communicative with us. And so I had so many more questions. So I got this grant to start, and then I just decided to go on and work with dogs alongside farm animals, which I still do as well. And so it's really exciting to do this work with dogs, because it's quite different. In many ways it's very similar, but in other ways it's very different, because if you work with a farm animal, then you don't have this close relationship. You're much more distant, so it's a little bit different, but the basic processes, the brains and how the animal behaves and how they learn and the emotional state, these things are very, very similar. So it's really nice to have these two different different species and work with in different ways with all around the same topic, which is emotion and animal welfare.
Yeah, and I can imagine it must be so interesting to kind of compare some of the similarities and differences that you get between species. And I mean, would you say you can extrapolate a lot of your research? I know some of the the key topics that you've looked at, as well as kind of the HPA axis, and also I think you've done some stuff on the gut-brain axis. Is that right as well?
Yes.
Is a lot of that, do you find that can be extrapolated between species, or is it fairly species specific?
No, I think a lot of it is very similar between species, even similar between us people and animals, because our brains, they really function in the same way. So of course, when you work with different species, you have to adapt your test a little bit. So you might, for us people, when we do behavioral tests that are not related on verbal language, then you might use something like vision, because people are really good at using their eyes and we're very visual. But a dog, for example, is not so visual. They're very good at hearing and using their noses. So we might adapt a test from human psychology, but more to a dog, and using their senses in a way that they can understand and learn it, even though the basic principles are still the same. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. So, I mean, so there's so many things I could ask you about today. So I'll try to stick to the topic. So obviously the topic we've got today is kind of, can we measure an emotion? I think to kind of get a bit of, or kind of make sure everyone's on the same page with what we're talking about as well, it would be good to get kind of your take firstly on really what is an emotion, and yeah, whether we can actually measure emotions, and how we might go about that.
Yeah, so what is an emotion? I guess everybody intuitively understands what an emotion is. And so the main thing that an emotion is a reaction to a specific event that's happening. And this can be an external event, for example, a sound, or somebody saying something or doing something, or a tasty food treat. Or it can also be an internal event, for example, a memory of something, or a certain, maybe even a feeling in the body, etc. And these emotions, they lead to very specific reaction, for example, in behavior and in physiology, and also in cognitive processes. So emotions are quite complex, and in humans, we think about them really intuitively. But when we're talking about animals, then of course it's quite different, because we cannot ask the animal what they feel. Like I can ask you, how do you feel? Oh, I feel happy. I just had a piece of chocolate. I feel great. But with an animal, it's not quite so simple. So we have to look more at things like their behavior and their physiology and their cognitive processes to get some idea of what's happening on the inside.
Okay. And so you mentioned looking at behavior, their physiology. What are the kind of behavioral and physiological measures that you might typically use to measure an emotion?
Yeah, so it can start really basic with, for example, just looking at how the animal reacts to something. So maybe I take a human as an example, because it's a bit easier sometimes to understand if we take ourselves as the center. So let's say, because I used to live in Australia, right? So we have some very big spiders there. And really big ones, and they're quite creepy. So let's say you are cleaning, you're in Australia, you're cleaning your house, and all of a sudden you see this massive spider, right? It surprises you. So your behavior is to first withdraw from it. You run away, probably.
Yeah,
and then your
definitely.
physiology, yes, definitely, right? Most people would. A few won't, I know, but most people would. And then you'd notice some differences in your physiology. You'd see your heart rate that will go up. You might start to sweat, and you might feel a little bit shaky. And your cognitive processes will also change, because you might be looking for the first exit. So you're very focused on escaping. Or depending a bit on the situation, you might actually be focused on killing that spider. So you might approach it and want to do something about it. So there's all these changes that are happening. So in animals, we can measure similar processes as well. So we can measure, for example, if the animal's scared of something, well, that animal probably won't approach what they're scared of. And if they do it slowly and in a specific way. They use a certain body language, they change their ears, etc. It can be the activity. For example, an animal that suddenly hears a loud sound probably runs away. So there's an increase in activity. And we see similar things in their physiology. So they might also, if we were to put like a polar heart rate equipment on them, we would see that the heart rate goes up. We might take a blood sample and measure cortisol, for example, which is a stress hormone. And what I've been doing a lot of work on in recent years, we can also measure cognitive processes, which I think is the most interesting way to measure emotions, because even though we use behavior and physiology as well, often what this measures most of the time is arousal. So it doesn't necessarily tell you if the emotion is good or bad, if it's negative or positive, but it tells you that it's really intense. So an intense emotion like this fear for a spider, or if it's a dog, it can be a reactive dog, it can be fear of another dog. We see really big changes in behavior. You might see a lot of barking or a lot of running. But, you know, if you throw a ball for a dog and you start playing with them, you might also see a lot of running and a lot of barking and a lot of activity. So it's not always so simple just looking at the behavior and the physiology, because also when you're playing with a dog, also the heart rate will go up, cortisol will go up. So it's measuring a lot of arousal, which is interesting in one way. It's useful. For example, when you know the context, you know, when I just show that dog something really scary, and obviously we see these changes, okay, the dog is scared. But sometimes we see these changes in behavior and in physiology, but there's nothing obvious in the environment that's triggering that. Maybe it's an internal state, maybe it's something really subtle. And then what do we do? So then behavior and physiology are only getting us so far. And then it's really interesting to look at more cognitive processes, because they can give us some more indication in what's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And perhaps kind of the way to lead on from that then is in terms of looking at cognitive processes and how they might kind of tell us about internal state. There's a couple of studies that that I wanted to ask you about that you've been involved in. I think one you were, I think, the first author on, and then one you were also listed as an author on. So I think perhaps if we started off with, because I know you mentioned you've got a good love of farm animals. I've got it here so I don't mess up the title. The study you published looking at chronic stress influences attentional and judgment bias and the activity of the HPA axis in sheep. And I was reading it this afternoon, and I thought one of the things that really stood out to me was the way that the way that you actually measured judgment bias in sheep was really, really interesting to look at. And although obviously as sheep, not dogs, those kind of biases, we can kind of anecdotally see them creep out in a similar way with kind of the way our dogs interact with their environment as well. So, I mean, yeah, perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about what you did in that study and some of the interesting findings.
Yeah, sure. I can tell you a bit about that study. And also you're saying these tasks that we use, the judgment bias test and the attention bias test, they are used in exactly the same way for dogs as well. So there's not even any modification that you need to do. They are used in the same way. So what we do, so it actually, these tests, they come from human psychology, because we can't ask the animal verbal questions. We've taken some tests from human psychology that are also based on non-verbal cues of emotion. And so what we've done, for people, it would be on, for example, a computer. So we've taken that out and adapted it to the animal. And what animals are usually really good in is spatial skills. So they're very good at orienting in the environment. They're very good at remembering specific places where there was tasty food or something bad happened. So we're using that skill of animals and then adapting our test to that. So what we did in this judgment bias test, and the question that we're asking here is, maybe you've heard of this also for dogs, is are they pessimistic or optimistic? And what this means is that we're looking at how the animal judges something that is not clearly negative and not clearly positive. It's a little bit ambiguous. So the question is the glass half full or half empty. And a dog or sheep that sees the glass is half empty, we would call pessimist. And if they see it half full, an optimist. And then we assume that optimistic responses are linked to positive emotions and negative responses of pessimistic responses to negative emotions. So coming back to my spatial test, how do we actually do that? So you want to go into practical details here, how we actually
absolutely.
measure? Yeah. So we have a spatial task. And how can we ask the if the glass is half full or half empty in space. It's actually quite simple, because what we do, we assign one corner of the arena. So we have a test arena and the animal is there alone, so it's not in a group. So we test each animal individually. And we first have a very long training phase, and we train them to associate one corner in the arena with a positive cue. And in the terms of the sheep that I used here, I think we used food in that study. That's the most common. I've used some other studies where we used social companionship. That's also possible, but most standard is food. So the sheep learn really, really quickly. Okay, if I go to that corner, then I will get a food treat. So you put them in the arena, and within a few seconds, they're there and eating. And then we take them out. And then the next time they come in, we start some negative training. And now the opposite corner is available to them. We have a cue there. You should go here. But when they do, there's actually something negative there. So in our case, there was a dog there, because a dog is a predator for sheep. But this was Australia, and they used to, herd the sheep. So sheep have a very strong negative association with dogs. This was a very old farm dog. It didn't even blink an eye. It was just sleeping there, but it was there. And so when the sheep approached that location, there was a dog. So that meant don't go there. So this is what we call a go, no-go task. So this location is available. Go there, you get your food treat. The other side is available. Don't go there. There's a dog. Stay away. Right? So we train the sheep in these two situations. And when they've learned this really well, so we spent several weeks training them to do this, then we show a location that's somewhere in between. So it's halfway the positive and halfway the negative. And then we look at the reaction of the animal. Does the animal then decide to approach? Then we call this an optimistic response, because we assume it was expecting to be rewarded by the food treat. But if the sheep decides not to go, then this is a no-go response or a pessimistic response. We assume that it was expected to be punished by seeing the dog. So this is how we can answer the question if they see the glass half full or half empty. So this is what we call a judgment bias. And then, of course, then you can manipulate the emotional state of the animal to validate if this is indeed happening, which is what we did in that experiment.
I think it's so interesting, isn't it? And what you did was looked at sheep that were experiencing chronic stress, right? And what I think was particularly strange in terms of the results of that study is the sheep that were chronically stressed looked as if they were possibly more optimistic or more showed increased sort of approach times to the positive food reward, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So we actually did not find what we had predicted, because they've shown in some other species and in sheep as well, that if they live in this kind of unpredictable, uncontrollable housing conditions, they get this depressive, pessimistic emotional state, and that is really associated with these pessimistic judgment biases as well. So we're thinking if we chronically stress the sheep, we should see a similar response, but we did not. And of course, we're not quite sure why this happened, but what we think is that when you put a chronically stressed sheep, and these sheep were really chronically stressed by deprivation, so they were restricted in social contact and they were restricted from lying. So they were in quite a barren situation. But then you put them in a test like this, where they get food treats. So this is a problem that happens quite often when we do this type of behavioral test. Just putting them in the test situation itself might be positive. So they actually know they get to work for treats in there, and they know they can avoid the dog because they've learned that. They know they don't have a chance to see it, so they're quite happy to be there working for the food treat. So that might be one of the explanations. And the other thing is that actually this chronic stress actually changed some things in their brain, which made them a little bit more risk-taking, perhaps, as well. So
Yeah, I mean, it's it's an interesting, because obviously I was reading it through and I was thinking, oh, so we're probably going to find that they're less optimistic, and then it turned out obviously they were more optimistic. So but it would be interesting to see a similar design applied to dogs as well, because I think obviously not necessarily every dog's in a very non-enriched environment, although there are some, but a lot of dogs don't necessarily get a lot of social contact outside their family. And obviously, like sheep, they are very social animals. So it would be interesting to kind of see how that affects their optimism, because I think that I don't know what your thoughts on this are, but I would have thought that might have quite important implications for socialization practices and things like that for dogs.
Yeah, there's actually been quite a few studies done in dogs. So one thing, actually, separation anxiety, that really induces a pessimistic judgment bias. So dogs that have separation anxiety and they're tested with the owner present, they are actually less likely to approach these ambiguous locations that are somewhere in between positive and negative. And also dogs that I think have some social fear, they are also more pessimistic. And also, for example, training with like punishment-based training methods, aversive methods, they are also more pessimistic. So I think it's a very similar test that's applied in dogs. It's often also a spatial task. So yeah, it seems that there is definitely similar processes happening in dogs. I haven't seen a study specifically looking at chronic stress, and I have to say the way that we set it up in sheep, it's quite rough on the animals, so I would not do something like that in dogs. We shouldn't really do this in sheep either, but we were kind of trying to simulate what happens on some of the farms to make a point. That's how it is sometimes. I have not seen a study like that, exactly like that in dogs, but I know also pain, for example, dogs that have chronic pain also are more pessimistic. So the big lines apply to dogs as well.
It's so interesting to think about. Because obviously that kind of pessimism optimism thing with dogs is so important in terms of how they interact with people, how they kind of, I suppose, perceive our intentions, which can often cause a problem if they do have that kind of more negative bias when a human approaches them, or when some fireworks start, as we were talking about earlier, or anything like that. Kind of that positive optimistic bias is such a kind of useful trait to have all round, for helping them kind of cope and interact well with the world. So something else I wanted to ask you about just on this study. So I know I'm spending a lot of time kind of dissecting this with you, but I thought the other really interesting thing that came up is you looked at obviously physiology as well a little bit, in both the acute and chronic stress conditions, and what you also did was you had the sheep that were chronically stressed, and then you induced acute stress. So they'd had that kind of chronic stress experience, and then they had some acute stress where they got sheared, I think. And I think, just to me, kind of what stood out is if we think about what we often think about with things like trigger stacking and kind of decompression and terms like that in the dog world. How would you perhaps link the sort of the way chronic stress and acute stress interact with kind of the dog world?
Because that was really my question with sheep as well, because most animals, they have a lot of chronic stress, like farm animals do. They're often in quite barren environment. When it's extensively reared animals, they might be hungry a large part of the year, and there's like handling stressors, and there's shearing, and dogs coming to get them. It's quite stressful. So it's, in a way, it's similar to dogs as well. The stresses are perhaps a little bit different. So with dogs, you might see more things like like not getting enough stimulation. Probably hunger is not such a big deal in dogs, I wouldn't think. But all kinds of stresses that together, when you layer them, that it builds up over time. And if there's these constant, persistent stresses, then eventually you'll get chronic stress. And then this chronic stress really has to be quite severe. I think with this sheep, it was really 9 days of constant stress. So it's not that when an animal gets 2 or 3 times a day, gets a little bit stressed, maybe if you have a dog that spooks from a loud noise once a day, I mean, that's not going to cause chronic stress. But it's these constant or persistent stresses over time for long periods of time. Then you might get a situation of chronic stress. And then what I was interested in, okay, if we have these chronically stressed animals and we apply a new stressor, an acute stressor, how well can they cope with that? So that's what we did here. And then we used shearing. These were quite young sheep, so they'd never been shorn before. So, and it's something that happens on the farm anyway. It was just a normal time of the year that they needed to be shorn. So we use this because we know it's very stressful, because they get flipped on their backs and it's somebody, a strange man with a big machine. It's loud and it takes about 5 minutes. So we know it's horribly stressful for them. So we just looked at their normal shearing practice and we took blood samples around it. And then we also looked again at their judgment bias in the same way. And what we found, I don't think we found actually that this acute stressor did a whole lot for the judgment bias. They weren't so different, I don't think. And it's probably because there's some sort of ceiling. At some point, we can't really see a difference anymore. And I think we found some differences in the physiology, though. I think we found quite some, was it, I can't remember from the top of my head.
I've got written down.
You got it there, yeah.
That you saw decreased ACTH responses in the chronic stress, but during acute stress, there was an increase of ACTH during the acute stressor. However, they were unable to mount a cortisol response reflective of that additional stress. So it's kind of like, again, a little bit like that sort of ceiling effect with the stress, which
and this is quite typical of chronic stress, because cortisol often is not different, because the receptors for cortisol on the adrenals, they get saturated quite quickly. And also when there's a lot of stress in the environment all the time, and there's chronic stress, there's all kinds of down regulation in the HPA axis. So you see that when it's the same type of stressor, there's not much. If you just take a cortisol sample, you don't really see anything. But then if you apply a new stressor and you have this down regulation of the axis, then you see a peak in ACTH. So that means they can still mount like a acute stress response to something new, but the old stressor doesn't really change cortisol anymore. And this is really a typical sign of chronic stress. This is also what's been found in rats, for example. So it's quite a lot in alignment with just the chronic stress theory and how the HPA axis gets down-regulated.
And when you say down-regulation, are you able to kind of explain what that means for those that might not have heard the term before?
Yeah, it's basically, I like to say it's a safety switch on the stress system, because if cortisol, which is the stress hormone that let's say there was this big spider coming in you get scared, then you get an increase in cortisol about 15 to 30 minutes later. And this cortisol that helps you to mobilize your glucose and gets you to run away and all these type of things. And it's really good when it's acute. The problem with cortisol is over a long time, it's actually damaging, because it also shuts down digestion, it compromises the immune system. And in an acute situation, that is not an issue, because all the energy can go to whatever fighting or running from the stressor. So you don't need the immune system or the digestive system at that point. But if you have these situations of chronic stress, then cortisol, of course, can really be damaging, because then you do need your immune system to function properly. So there's kind of a safety switch that shuts down these increased levels of cortisol after a while. So cortisol goes back to normal. So when you take just a baseline blood sample, you don't really measure any increase in cortisol in chronically stressed animals most of the time. Sometimes it's even lower. So this safety switch down regulates the whole system, but at the same time, it does keep the sensitivity to new stresses, which is why we see a much higher increase in ACTH towards a new stressor in these animals. It's quite complicated physiologically. So it gets
a bit of a headache to try and think about kind of the whole
trying
different
to get your head around it.
But I think, one kind of interesting takeaway there is hopefully I've got this right, to jump in if I've misunderstood this, but in those chronically stressed animals, it becomes kind of that mechanism to handle stress, which is of course cortisol release, to actually kind of handle those stressors, doesn't work as well.
No, they cannot mount a cortisol response as well as a normal animal, or a non-chronically stressed animal can. Yeah, because the whole stress system is actually messed up. And we know from like rodent models and even in humans where they looked at big studies that this is actually a really big risk factor for like depression and anxiety like disorders. So when this happens, there's really it's not a good thing if this
Yeah.
happens. We don't want this in our animals to happen.
Yeah, and I think that's really important as well, because there's
Yeah.
a lot of kind of stuff out there about kind of cortisol being a bad thing, but of course it is part of a normal process as well. It's just when we're
Absolutely.
getting that kind of chronic exposure that it's not necessarily such a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, normal increase in cortisol is not a problem. I mean, cortisol also increased during positive situations, like a dog playing or running after a ball increases cortisol. But those things are not a problem, because the brain knows the difference between a bad stressor that increases cortisol and something nice that increases cortisol. It knows it really well because it's integrated in the brain in very different ways.
Yeah.
So yeah, we don't need to worry about every tiny little stressor or every time cortisol gets increased. It's really these persistent stressors, and especially when the animal has no way of escaping or finding a way of coping with the stressor. That's when we're looking at chronic stress situations.
Yeah. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. Thank you for sharing all of that. So perhaps to kind of jump on to one of your more recent papers that you're also an author on, which I think was the first paper that I actually discovered your work from. Someone shared it with me, is the paper you published called Attentional Scope as a Novel Indicator of Emotional State in Animals. And I think in that one you specifically looked at dogs, right?
Yes.
So yeah, again, perhaps do you want to tell us a little bit about what you did there?
Yeah. So here I just wanted to get a different perspective on the emotional state, because I've been working on judgment bias and also attentional biases for a few years. But of course, every test that we measures probably one quite specific aspect of the emotional state. So I wanted to see, well, is there any other aspect that can complement these measures that we already have, just so we can get a broader view and maybe use it in different situations as well. Because what judgment bias does, it's really meant to measure valence, so positive, negative, or pessimistic, optimistic. But what it cannot do is, for example, within an emotional state, so we might have a positive valence emotional state, but there can be different degrees within that, and that it can probably not detect that very well. Of course, we can measure arousal looking at behavior, but I was interested in trying to find another test that could be a little bit more detailed, asking a bit more detailed question about the emotional state. So then I came to attentional scope. Again, this comes from human psychology. And here it's really depending on the motivational or the arousal state of the animal as well. So it depends. So what attentional scope measures, so it's another cognitive test, and it measures attentional processes, but it really looks at how broad the attention is and how narrow the attention is. So in people, what we know is that the first studies that came out was looking at positive versus negative emotions. So people feel really good, they're happy, and they have everything they need to have a very broad attentional scope. And that means that they kind of pick up things in their environment all the time, and they're very creative, and they pay attention, and they have really good problem solving because they pick up different cues all the time. Well, somebody who's really anxious, they get this narrow tunnel vision because they're constantly focused on whatever is triggering their anxiety. So these things you can measure really nicely in a lab in people. And when they did a few more studies, it turned out it wasn't so simple, that it's not just positive and negative, but it also depends on a motivational state. So if it's an approach or a withdrawal emotion. I won't go too much into the technical details here, but I wanted to apply the same test to dogs as well to see if we could do the same thing. So that's what we did in this study. And a nice thing with the attentional scope is that the test had already been applied to animals, but looking at species differences, because it depends on the species. So here, it does matter what kind of species you look at. So people and monkeys were very broad, even in a neutral emotional state, while, for example, pigeons and fish, they're quite narrow. And we know from some studies in dogs that they were kind of a bit 50-50. Dogs are a little bit in between. They don't have a clear preference for broad or narrow. So what we did here, we wanted to induce different emotional states, and we did that in the lab. So we have beagles living on campus, and we used food treats to get like a high motivation or high arousal state. We gave them a round of sausages, so you know what a dog looks like when you give them sausages, right? They get very happy and excited and jumping and crazy. And then we had another treatment when we gave them sausages for 20 minutes. So he would try to get like a low motivation positive state, so they eat until they're completely satisfied, content, and then they should relax because they've just eaten like all the sausages in the world. And then we looked at the negative side as well. So here we pretended they were going to give sausages, so but the bowl was empty, so he would try to get like a disappointment, so kind of a low arousal negative state, like it kind of sucks for them, but it's not something scary. And we also had a high arousal negative state. So here we put these sausages underneath a rack that they couldn't get it. So you get frustration. And then we applied these tests. But what we found actually in this study with dogs is that it also, like judgment bias, we mostly picked up arousal. So we could see a difference between the positive and the negative conditions, but not between the high and the low arousal ones. Yeah. So yeah, but it was also the opposite, because we found actually that the getting something that they want, so this high arousal positive, was really narrow, which makes sense. It's the same in people. If you tell people they're going to get dessert, they also become quite narrow with tunnel vision because they want to get to that chocolate. And so we're not sure if it was because it was beagles or because it was sausage, that even after 20 minutes of sausages, they were still equally in this narrow state of getting what they want. While we had the negative conditions and they were much more broad. It was kind of 50-50, not extremely broad, because probably these emotional states were not particularly affecting them so much. It was really the sausages that got them going.
Yeah, I think that
you know what a
one of those
beagle and
ones
sausage looks like, right? Yeah.
It lines up with, I think, probably what we all kind of see with our own dogs, right?
Yeah.
As soon as you get, something that they're really motivated out, that attentional focus goes. And again, I think it's important to think about how we kind of apply that knowledge of how it affects our attention when you are working with dogs, because that does get dogs in trouble sometimes, right? Doesn't it? Where we kind of see that attentional narrowing, we've got some food, and then maybe kind of another dog runs up, or someone comes to try and stroke them or something. You're doing your really good clicker training, or you're teaching a dog to be social in public. Someone comes along, tries to stroke them, and they jump out their skin, maybe have a bad reaction. Because that attentional focus had narrowed. So you're kind of maybe doing some training or something like that with the best of intentions. But it kind of backfires because you see that narrowing.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what happens. And so they get this tunnel vision. They're so focused on getting their treats, there's nothing that can shake them. So if you were to disturb them in the process, which we didn't do in this experiment because it was very standardized setup. But I can imagine if you were to come in and demand they do something completely different, that they might be quite not so much agreeing with you. And exactly.
It's interesting, the other thing that you use, so you compared using food rewards and also social rewards in the experiment. And I don't think, did you find not anything but significant that came up with using the social rewards?
No, I don't think that had a strong effect as the food had.
So I suppose from that, what is your take in terms of using social reward as part of behavior modification or training for dogs?
Well, I have to say these dogs were a little bit special because they were living in the kennels there. They are lab dogs. So it's not that these dogs live with an owner. So they didn't have that attachment with us while we were doing this experiment as a dog perhaps would have with their owner. So there's a little bit of a note there. These were not normal dogs in that way. That said, they really enjoyed the interaction with us. They all wanted to be petted. They all wanted to play, even though people before we started the experiment said, oh no, these dogs are not interested in that. They don't really care, but they actually cared. They cared quite a lot. So I am quite sure that it was perceived as positive by them. But clearly, if we compare with the food, it didn't quite match up. Even though if we look, we also took a lot of video analysis. I had some students analyzing all the body language as well. I haven't looked at it yet. But it seemed that they were, from their body language, definitely experiencing it as positive. So why we didn't measure this in the test, perhaps it didn't lead to that same kind of narrowing as a food treat in a way. Maybe play, of course, it's a different motivation, it's a different emotion, so it might simply not have the same effect on cognition as getting food.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, it's
Possibly.
one of those things. It would be useful to know more about that, because kind of working in a behavior modification perspective, being able to have a reinforcer that leaves attention quite wide, whereas having another a reinforcer that kind of narrows attention is quite a useful sort of variable tool to use.
Yes, it is. Yeah, because in that way, and again, it's the only study in animals and in dogs done so far. So I think I wouldn't draw such very strong conclusion yet. I'd like to see this repeated. We actually have repeated it, but I haven't analyzed the data yet. We have repeated it in pet dogs as well, but I haven't analyzed the data. But until then,
Yeah.
Yeah, we have to be a little bit careful because these dogs were quite different. So I think, and with any study, really, it's 10 dogs only. So it's just the beginning. It's just a proof of concept. Yes, this test works, but I don't think we can say anything about the detail, about the implications too much yet. Yeah, I think we really need more and more data. Oh, this is such a boring scientist thing to say, isn't it? We need more data.
Yeah, but I mean, I think in terms of things that we could look to potentially in the future, it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Yes.
I think so. Yeah, it'll be super interesting to see what comes out, I suppose, in this area next.
Yeah.
So I suppose to kind of finish off for the last few minutes, I've got a couple of questions I've noticed that have come up as well, so we'll definitely come to those as well. But I suppose the final kind of big thing that I wanted to touch on with you is kind of in practice, and in I know you've done some work behavior consulting yourself, for kind of those that work as behavior consultants or trainers or work with animals, even I suppose in terms of veterinary assessments or you know, just kind of making sure, or groomers, you know, trying to make sure an animal's maybe safe or get an idea of what sort of emotional mindset an animal is coming into in any sort of setting. Are there any kind of cognitive tests or cognitive clues that you'd recommend kind of looking out for that might give you some idea of an animal's emotional state coming in, or are we kind of not at the point where we've got good enough tests yet?
Yeah, I think with these cognitive tests, so they're quite specific and they take a lot of training. So it's not something you just do in a setting. The attention bias, we haven't talked about that so much. That's a little bit simpler. This is just when we play, for example, like a threat, and then we'll look at how the animal responds to the threat. Do they orient towards it and look at it, or do they, for example, ignore it and go and do something else? So we found in the sheep study and also in the pig study that when the animals are chronically stressed or more anxious, that they tend to avoid threats. So I think, and this is similar to what's been found in people as well, because they do this, we think, because the stressor is too much. So whatever threat it is, it can be a sound, it can be something, another dog or a person if they're scared of people. If they're in this anxious state, very often they might avoid it. And that's a natural reaction because it helps them to cope with the stress, right? But at the same time, when that happens, they don't get the opportunity to learn that there actually wasn't anything to be afraid of. And so this is in human psychology, they also call this like the cycle of anxiety, because it maintains the anxiety, because the animal's anxious, there's something scaring it, it avoids, and it's temporary, the anxiety is relieved, but in the long run, it only increases the anxiety because the animal afterwards, and we've shown this in the lab as well, afterwards, the animal becomes more vigilant because it knows, oh, there was something there. Where's the next thing going to come from? What's happening next? So they keep being vigilant. And the moment something happens, they go, oh no, I don't want to look. I don't want to look. And again, they don't learn that there was nothing there. And here we're talking really about anxious animals. So animals that are not particularly triggered by something, for example, like separation anxiety. So the animal might not be alone, it might just be walking out on the street, but there's this constant avoidance of everything, and the animal kind of almost like withdraws and stops paying attention and stops realizing that there's nothing to be afraid of. So I think that's probably the best thing to be aware of when we're working with anxious animals, not with animals that are not anxious, then it's different. So these really specifically for anxious animals, is to be aware that this avoidance in the end maintains anxiety. Because what I see a lot of people do is that they like distract the dog. For example, there's a lot of treats as a distraction, which is fine in a moment when you have nothing else, but as a behavior modification, that could lead to actually maintaining the anxiety.
So it's really supporting the dog to find that kind of safety behavior, that kind of avoidance behavior.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and and this is also, so I think that is something to think about. And of course, there's a difference between just giving the dog full on exposure without any ways to manage. I'm not saying you should do that. I mean, it has to be gentle and in a way that the animal can cope. But if you're always working on avoiding whatever is there, that can in the end make the anxiety worse. Yeah.
And I think that's also, if anyone works with cats as well, that's a massive challenge for cats as well, because they are so good at avoiding kind of things that they don't like the sound of or the look of.
Exactly. And then it gets really difficult to get them out there because they never get to experience that it's actually nothing to be scared of. Yeah. But doing this in a good way, of course, is the difficult part, because you can push it too far, and of course then it's something that is truly scary. But so there's a fine balance.
It's a hard balance to go. And I suppose actually, if we were to link it back to the kind of HPA axis and your work on there, sort of what sort of stress physiology might kind of be a good place for an animal when you are trying to get that learning?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, because there's you probably know this as well, but there's quite a big link between like arousal and cortisol and learning. So if you have this kind of like an inverted U curve, I don't have a slide here, but
you can imagine kind of the U,
So there's kind of an optimal zone where you have the right amount of arousal and the right amount of cortisol for learning to happen. So if you have zero arousal or extreme arousal, then there's no learning taking place, at least not the kind of learning that we want. There are other types of learning taking place that we don't want. But if you want to work on a behavioral modification program and teach a dog something, you need to be in that kind of golden zone when they have the right amount of arousal so that a learning process can take place. Because if they're completely relaxed, and sometimes people do that, but they're so far in the relaxation side that there's no learning taking place there either. And of course, the other side, if they push it too far, then the dog just panics and stresses, and then there's no learning either. So it's just getting that balance right.
And it's going to be quite hard, obviously, as well, with some dogs to find that point between kind of total relaxation and absolutely having a panic attack in response to the thing. So I mean, it's the challenges of, I suppose, behavior modification with dogs, really, isn't it?
And it varies with each individual dog too, of course. It's that makes it so hard, isn't it? So you really have to look at the animal, what can they handle, and where is their limit. And
actually, one of the questions that has come up in the comments as well, I don't know if you've seen, is might you expect to see any differences between breeds in terms of, actually this says between judgment bias in breeds, but also I suppose in terms of the variability in between breeds in responsiveness or stress physiology or anything like that at all that you're aware of?
Good question. I think the breed question is a tricky one. I'm personally not convinced there are huge breed differences. Of course, there's breed differences in terms of what we bred the animals for. So we see, of course, certain breeds like to chase a lot, while others like to bark a lot. But when it comes to the emotion, I'm not convinced that there are huge differences. I mean, we see so many similarities between species even. yeah, so I find that a difficult one, and I think the literature is a little bit conflicting too. Some of the biggest studies have shown that there's very little breed differences, and others have come out that there are some. Yeah, so I think I would definitely not fall into breed stereotypes. Oh, it's this breed, so if they are always scared, I would not. Yeah, I will be very careful with that, because it's easy to do that. We like to see patterns as well, even when they're not.
Yeah,
So
and I suppose that's back to our own judgment biases as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and judgment biases between breeds, is that the same answer then as well?
Yeah, I wouldn't expect to see that. To be honest, no study has been done, but I wouldn't think there would be big differences in judgment bias. Of course, it's difficult. Some dogs, of course, if you have a dog that's really bred, for like sense or something, and you were to apply a test that uses sense, then you might pick up differences with a dog that's bred for guarding or something. But then there might be an issue with the test rather than with the emotional state, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that just shows probably some of the issues that probably contribute to some of the confusion around the breed research, because kind of what are we actually seeing the difference with? Are we seeing an issue with testing because there's a breed difference that kind of just causes a dog to respond slightly differently to a test, or is it because that we're seeing a difference in the thing that we're actually trying to look at? So it's a big challenge, isn't it? And breed research is always a nightmare to try and understand, as there is so much conflict.
It is really, really difficult. Yeah. So I'm quite careful with assuming that there are big breed differences. But who knows? Maybe in the future, when we get the perfect test and we can make these comparisons really, really well. Who knows?
Yeah. And something else on the kind of the topics of judgment biases. I know we've mentioned the optimist pessimist kind of bias. Are there any other judgment biases that you might commonly see in animals or dogs specifically?
Oh, judgment biases. Yeah, again, it depends a bit what kind of test you apply, because we have different types of judgment biases as well. So the most common one is the spatial task, the no-go task, but there's also, for example, go task. And depending also even what kind of reinforcers you use, you might get slightly different results. So again, the big picture, it seems to apply across species, but when you get into the details, we do find some inconsistencies, and probably, again, it's because we use slightly different methodologies.
Yeah.
But then when you go away from judgment biases, there are probably also, for example, memory biases. So for an animal that is in a negative state, they might have a better memory of bad things that have happened to them. And this is a bit less researched, but even in rats, I think there is some evidence that happens. So there's also those type of biases. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's obviously quite well known in humans, isn't it, in terms of the memory biases that we see if you've had a bad thing that's happened to you. So it would be interesting to kind of grow our understanding in terms of what might be seen there. So I know the most of the stuff I've seen on your page is mostly is it mostly attentional bias and judgment?
Yeah.
So is memory bias is something you're going to be looking at in the future?
I haven't got any plans for that now, but it will be a nice thing to do. But it's tricky though. It's difficult. It's very, very difficult. So I think that's why most people haven't touched it, because to do that in a standardized way is tricky. Yeah.
Okay. Brilliant. So I'm just going to have a look to finish off then if there are any other questions that have come up. Oh yes, someone's asked as well. Can you recommend any recent equine papers discussing cognitive biases at all, please?
Oh yes, there's plenty in horses as well. Yeah. definitely. I don't know from the top of my head, but I can maybe send you some, and then you
Yeah,
can.
absolutely. If you want to send me some, I can
Yeah.
put them in the comments
Yeah.
after this as well.
Yeah,
So,
I can send a list
so-
with dog papers and a list with horse papers.
oh,
Yeah.
that'd be fantastic. I'm
Yeah.
sure people would be delighted to have a read of that. Brilliant. So if anyone
Yeah.
else has got any questions, do put them in the comments and I can read them out, as we've got a couple of minutes left. What I'll also get you to perhaps do in the last couple of minutes is for those that want to find out more about what you've been doing and where they can see you in the future, have you got anything coming up, kind of particularly, I suppose, animal behaviour related, dog behaviour related, that people might be interested in?
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, definitely. I have at the moment I have a short course about separation anxiety in dogs, and this is just a self-study course, and this is not to treat separation anxiety itself, but it's the steps that should take place before you treat separation anxiety. Because many people start on these training programs, like building up the time and the desensitization, but if all the other steps before that haven't been put in place, and here I'm thinking about working on attachment and understanding the attachment style of the dog, general stress reduction. I talk a lot about these pessimistic and optimistic biases, good stress coping skills, etc. If those haven't been worked on, good predictable environments, predictable routines, etc., then it gets really, really difficult to start working on separation anxiety. And there's so many people that fail these kind of training programs because that first bit is missing.
Yeah.
So I have this course that addresses just that part. So before you even start thinking about leaving the dog alone.
That
and
sounds
this is
really cool.
Yeah, and this course it's for owners, but also for trainers. So it does go. It was all science-based. I mean, everything I do is science-based. Every claim I make is based on the study. So, but it's not as in-depth as, for example, the noise phobia course that we will probably in English. I hope we will run it in August, and this is very specific only for dog trainers and behaviorists. Very detailed about noise phobias and the science behind that, and what we can do to actually better understand these dogs, but also what kind of methods we can use to actually help them cope with these noise phobias and how we can help them overcome these fears.
Brilliant. So so you've got an English language one coming out in August, possibly, for that one, and then the separation anxiety as well. Is that what languages do you have that in at the moment?
That's English. That's English, and that's just available. That's a self-study course that you can just look at the written materials and the videos, and then there's a live Q&A as well, where people can ask questions. Amazing. And if they have anything coming up during the videos in the course that they take, they can ask those questions in the Q&A. So
amazing. So no, both sound really, really good. I'll have to check out the separation one as well, and the noise phobias when that comes out.
Yes.
I mean, I know noise phobias is such a prevalent issue with dogs, and I think one issue that comes up a lot, I don't know what your take on this is as well, is there's a lot of using kind of stereo equipment or things with speakers to create noises, and what I've learned with that is obviously it's only designed for the human hearing range rather than the dog hearing range. So I don't know if you had any ideas on how to kind of circumvent that issue as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is the tricky thing with noises. I mean, we talked about, like, somebody, I didn't even notice, but somebody told me that in the Netherlands, at least, there's a whole list of where fireworks is going to be. So you can find this town, there will be fireworks on Saturday at 9 o'clock. So if you want, you can go and take a group of dogs that is ready for this kind of training and be maybe 10 kilometers away from it. So you can get this kind of real life exposure, but at a really mild level. So I think some people are experimenting with those type of things, and maybe using some children fireworks that's not as intense, to kind of simulate those type of sounds. Because you're right, for some dogs it works really well with the stereo and the light flashes, and for others it doesn't, because maybe they also respond to the smoke, or there's something in the sound, like you're saying, that they are picking up that's not on the stereo. So then using this kind of real life sound, but at an intensity that it can handle, is very, very difficult, especially when it comes to fireworks. So you have to be really creative in getting the right type of stimuli, but at the right level of intensity. Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think that sounds brilliant. So I'll definitely check out that course, and if you want to send that course to me when if it does become available, if you want to send it to me, I'll definitely share it on my page, because I'd love I'm sure lots of people that have been here today would love to get an update on it as well.
Yeah, that would be great. I have a wait list already, so I can send you the link now. So if people can already sign up for the wait list, and then if it comes out, you get an email straight away. So I can send you the link and then post it there if people are interested. Yeah,
that's ideal. And where can people find out more about you as well? It's Amazing Animal Minds is your main page, is that right?
Yes, amazinganimalminds.com is the website, and then there's a Facebook page also called Amazing Animal Minds. And then there's an Instagram, but the Instagram is mostly in Dutch, but it's also Amazing Animal Minds. I mix languages a little bit, so if people go to Facebook and they find Dutch, or they go to Instagram and find English or Dutch, it's a bit of a mixture, but the Facebook is mostly English. So yeah, if people want to go to the Facebook page, that's probably for the English language, that will be the best one, or the website, of course. Yeah.
That's brilliant, thank you. So I'll just see if anyone's put any questions in the meantime. So I think that's pretty much it on the questions. Actually, one thing I did write down beforehand, if you've got time for one final question.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So I know one model that's very prevalent in the dog world for measuring and kind of understanding emotions. So I think it's definitely worth obviously just touching on today and getting your opinion on it, is kind of the Panksepp 7 of affective state models, where you've got kind of the seeking system and the rage system and all those kind of 7 systems. I just wondered what was your opinion on kind of the application of that in dog behavior and then that kind of model itself?
Yeah, actually, animal welfare science, I mean, it is mentioned in some of the literature, but in practical terms, it's not something that we measure those things on the animals. Like the gold standard of really measuring animal emotions in the lab is really judgment bias. And of course, Panksepp is really nice ideas because he's kind of pinpointed in the brain what the circuits are that have these different types of emotion. But it's not something that you can measure in the lab like that on an animal in terms of behavior. And the other thing, it's tricky because it talks a little, it's not quite discrete emotions. Like discrete emotions is the labeling of emotion, which we tend to avoid in like animal welfare, because we don't want to assume that when an animal experiences something as rage, that it is the same type of rage that we also experience. So we tend to use a slightly different model. But of course, Panksepp is really useful because he's looking more from a neuroscience perspective, while for animal welfare science, we come more from the behavior perspective. So of course, these things all complement, but they're not exactly the same, but it's useful. So it's just different viewpoints on things, people coming in from different subject areas and just picking up on different things. It's nothing is really wrong or right, they're just complementary. I see it as a big puzzle sometimes. You have pieces of the puzzle everywhere, and then we try to match them together to get kind of the picture of the puzzle. That is tricky. So I see that Panksepp's part is one piece, and we have judgment bias as a piece. We have behavior indicators as a piece. We have stress physiology as a piece. And we kind of try to fit them all together to get the overall picture.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of looking at it. And I think it's interesting, isn't it, as well, because I know a lot of people like kind of going straight to the neuroscientific measures as being kind of the gold standard, but they're not necessarily going to be the most accurate. Because if we do, for example, try and measure like dopamine levels, you're going to be doing it in kind of the urine, which is not going to tell you a lot about dopamine levels moment to moment, or any other similar.
No, I think when we're really looking at, especially when our outcome is behavior, we have to look at the behavior. That's the main thing. Sure, it's interesting what's happening in the brain, but when our outcome is behavior, when our outcome is learning, that's what we have to measure, and that's what we have to work with.
Yeah.
So I think
yeah, I completely agree. I think that's such a cool way of looking at it. So yeah, thank you so much again. So I'm going to stop asking questions before we go on all night for you. So thank you so much for coming along today and talking to everyone. It's been absolutely fascinating to talk to you. I'll definitely share all those links that you have got available for all the studies, and also your own upcoming courses, which I know lots of people will be super interested in. So yeah, thank you again for joining us, and hopefully I'll be able to talk to you again soon, or see you at a conference or something like that soon.
Yeah. Well, thank you for inviting me. It was really nice to talk to you today. So I hope you enjoyed it too, and that the people enjoyed it. And if there's any questions afterwards, people hopefully know where to find me on Facebook. So feel free to ask questions there, or continue I haven't seen actually the question on the page here, but of course we can continue there as well if there's more questions after this. So thank you very much. It was really nice to have these type of conversations.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.